Hello, in this video we're going to take a look at the AJAX functionality within RackForms in the form of a beginner slash starter job, right? You want to use AJAX functionality. I want to show you the easiest way to understand and use it yourself. So first things first, AJAX functionality does require that we have a database table. This may change in the future and that it may be driven by, say, JSON queries, but for now we do need a database. So to that end, I have a database right here, and I have two tables. I have table 1 and table 2. Now, an AJAX query doesn't necessarily need two tables, but in most cases, it makes sense if you have more than one table. And the reason why is because an AJAX query is essentially creating a relationship between two different pieces of data, and usually those two pieces of data are in two different tables. And so I've created such a relationship here. I have table 1. Notice it has two columns. It has ID and name, and I have three names already set. And then I have table 2. And table 2 then has two columns called name ID and age. So name ID relates back to the first table, that is table 1. So what we're essentially saying is that the user with ID 1 right here, that is name ID, has an age of 33. The user with an ID of 2, that is, name ID 2, has an age of 21. If I wanted to fill out the third table, or the third user, I'd say Tom, who has a user ID of 3. So here, Tom, user ID 3, would have an age of, let's say, 56. So each one of these users now relates to the second table. There's nothing in the database that says these two tables are related. We've just simply created the relationship by hand. We've created a column called name ID, and this name ID column relates back to the ID values in the first table. And so in RackForms then, how do we actually create that relationship? How do I, in other words, allow a user to see a list of names, and then when they select a name, that user's age? So in RackForms, I'd create a standard form page, and I'd create a select item called names. Names then is going to be driven by a database query, so I'm going to scroll down to our data source area, and I'm going to say yes to dynamic query, and then I'm going to write some SQL that populates a select item with these names in table 1. So to do that, I'm going to select name from table 1. So let's go ahead and select name from table 1. Now, if I run this form right now, we're going to see now that I have a list of names, Steve, Mike, and Tom. Now what I want to do is I want to create a relationship between these two columns. Now what's key about this is the relationship field between table 1 and table 2 is not actually name, right? It's not Steve, Mike, or Tom. It's actually this value right here, this ID field. So I know that I have to include ID in my select statement right here. So I'm going to add that right now. Now when I run my form, you'll notice I still have Steve, Mike, and Tom, but if I look at the value field right here, it has a value of 1, 2, and 3. This is really, really important because this is the value that's going to be passed to and used by the AJAX query, right? So a user is going to see the value Steve, but what they're actually going to get is 1, 2, or 3 right here. That's really, really important to understand. Now, further to that point, you notice here that I'm selecting name, comma, ID. There's this little tooltip right here that basically says all items are displayed as label value. In other words, the label of this field is going to be the first column I select, and the value is going to be the second column I select. If I change this, if I instead made it ID, comma, name, well, the ID is now the label, and the name is the value. And of course, if I build this, you'll see that that's actually what we have. Of course, if I look at my values right here, we'd further see that our values are now our names. And that's not what we actually want right here. I want to pass the AJAX query the ID field. Primarily, we do this because it would be really hard for users to understand, or to remember numbers, right? Users are going to have a much easier time looking at a name and then letting the ID value propagate behind the scenes. Okay, so we're halfway there. We have a field now that we want to drive another select field from. So let's go ahead and add a select field, and we'll call this one age. So I want to select a name here and have the age show up here. To do that, I'm going to add my AJAX field right here. Now the AJAX field has two main areas that I set up. The first is the SQL query, and then the second is the bindings. So first things first, the select field. So essentially, when we're building AJAX logic in RackForms, we just want to take a step back and say, right, what do I actually want to show in this field right here? Well, I know that I want to show the age value. So I know that my query is going to select age, but I also know that my related column, name ID, needs to be part of that as well. So I'm going to select age from table 2, where, and this is the important part, name ID equals some value. So name ID equals question mark, which means some value. Now just a real quick aside about this, these question marks means that RackForms is actually using prepared statements. Now you may have heard the term SQL injection attacks in the past. Basically, when we're using dynamic queries like this, we never actually want to pass SQL to a system, we just want to pass variables. And that's what this question mark means. It means that we're not passing a string value like something like this to the query, we're actually passing just a parameter to the SQL engine. A parameter means that you can't actually use SQL injection attacks at all because you're never passing SQL, you're just passing values. I know it's a bit much to understand if you've never really looked at that before, but that's why we use these question marks, is because they are, in short, very, very safe and secure. There's one other thing that I should mention about this though, which is that there is something implicit happening here. In other words, I'm selecting age from table 2, where name ID equals some value. Well, the some value is the next thing that we're going to set up, right? This is going to become the value that we pass in from this select item right here. So let's go ahead and set up our bindings right now. So I have an SQL query that's going to select an age from table 2 where the name ID equals the value that I'm passing in. So here's where the bindings come in. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit and I'm going to go to AJAX update binding options. Now, first things first, I'm going to say, well, which field do I actually want to be watching when this AJAX logic is happening? And I want to watch the names field. So this names field right here is going to watch for an event, in this case, an onChange event. The reason why we're watching for onChange is because select items fire onChange events. So watch the name field, on and change event, and then fire off our AJAX logic. The second part of this then is we need to say this field, age right here, is what's going to receive the update. So that's where we go to item options / AJAX bindings. I'm going to say bind this field, in this case age, and I want to bind its label element with the age value that my SQL query is returning. So let's see how this works. So when I select one of these names, an onChange event is going to be fired. That is, this names field has an onChange event that's going to be fired. And when I do that, when I change names right here, the onChange event is going to fire off my SQL query. And because we're returning the age column from our database query, I want to bind the age field with that age column from the database. And you can see now that if I select Steve, his age shows, Mike's age shows, and finally Tom's age shows. So let's do that one more time just so you can see the whole process. Let me go ahead and delete this whole table and the whole page. And we'll start over again. So first things first, I have my select field. We know that we want to show names. And because AJAX logic, again, usually is going to require dynamic data, we almost always drive it with a data source query. So I'll say yes. And again, we want to select, if we go back here, the ID and name from the table. So I want to select ID, name from table 1. Again, though, it's important to note that RackForms always displays things as label value. So oops, I probably want to actually swap these two so that the label that's shown to my user is the name and the value behind the scenes is ID. I'm then going to create a second select menu, and this one's going to be called age. And then age is going to be driven by our AJAX query. The AJAX query again selects the age from table 2, where the name ID field equals the value that we pass in. Again, this is a prepared statement, and this question mark right here means that we're implicitly passing in the age ID value from this guy right here. In other words, we don't need to say what our specific parameter is. We just say a question mark means that you're going to get a value from this select item, and the value is going to be the ID field of the name that we selected. We then scroll down and we set our bindings. So we say, right, I have to tell RackForms what event I want to watch for and what field. In this case, the field I'm watching is names, and the event is going to be onChange. Finally, the binding options are how I actually drive this guy right here. So I want to bind the age field. I want to make sure that it gets the age value displayed. So once again, I'll save this. I select Steve. We get that value, that value, that value. Now, in closing, I should really quickly mention here that one of the reasons why we have so many options is because there's a lot of different ways that your AJAX logic may be different from this or may need to be more advanced. And RackForms is an advanced form builder, so we always support that. So for example, one of the things that we've done right here is we've selected watch this field. And you'll notice that we select an event. Now the key here is that watch this field, in this case, names and an onChange event, makes sense because select items use onChange events to fire off logic. However, if this was a text field, we would watch for a different event, such as on blur, on click, on mouse over, etc. Right? So we don't just lock you into just using select items. You can actually use almost any field type that you want. Furthermore, the item options / AJAX bindings right here, you may have noticed that we have this little plus and X button right here. We can actually bind multiple fields to different form fields. So for example, I could actually create another form field element right here and then create a second binding where I watch a different field and populate a different value. It's an incredibly powerful thing, for example, with an order form. So maybe I want to select a username from a previous order, and I want to populate a name and address field. And based on the query that we're running right here, maybe we would select name, comma, address, and then when I run this AJAX query, we'd actually say, right, populate the name and the address column that the AJAX query returned. And of course, that's a very common and very powerful thing to be able to do. Finally, I should say that we have lots of example jobs that show off AJAX functionality. So if I click Load Example Job and scroll down to AJAX, you notice that we have a bunch of example jobs here that show off different areas of this component. So we have custom results, multiple fields, AJAX processing mode, etc. There's a lot of powerful stuff in here. And I suggest giving a look because generally the way RackForms works, if it's something that's more advanced than just doing the simple stuff that we did right now, it's going to be supported. It's a very, very powerful feature, and hopefully you will find good use for it. Of course, if you have any questions, please let us know at info@rackforms.com.